Welcome back to the podcast. In today's episode, I'm going to walk you through how to ensure you're building the most muscle possible with the time you're putting in the gym. So, I'm going to start by quickly going over the basics of what actually is hypertrophy. Then, we'll dive into how we want to apply it within our training. And finally, I'll walk you through some real life examples of what a workout and a training block could look like to maximize your results. So to put it very simply, hypertrophy is the increase in size of muscle cells, which leads to a growth in muscle mass. In bodybuilding, hypertrophy specifically refers to muscle hypertrophy, building larger muscles through resistance training, nutrition, and recovery. Now, if we're trying to get every ounce of muscle growth possible, we need to understand what actually drives hypertrophy. To get into hypertrophy training, let's start with a few foundational terms. We're looking at overload, adaptation, fatigue, and recovery, and how they interact to create a hypertrophic response. First, we have overload. This is essentially a disruption to homeostasis through training. Every time you lift and load those muscle fibers, you're challenging the body's baseline state, which is where the adaptation begins. Then, that leads me to adaptation, which is the body's response to that overload. It's what happens as your body adjusts, leading to increased strength, muscle size, and as well as endurance. After that overload, you experience fatigue. So that's a temporary decrease in performance and strength, and it's completely expected and part of the process as long as it doesn't go chronic and then you dig yourself into a hole and then you can no longer recover. And lastly, that's recovery. So recovery brings you back up, ideally to a higher baseline than before. This whole process is what we call the fitness fatigue model. You create an overload, your fitness dips due to fatigue, then you recover, and when done correctly, you come back stronger, setting yourself at a new baseline. So, what's the goal with hypertrophy training? What are we trying to get? It's trying to create just enough stimulus to trigger muscle growth without overwhelming the body with too much fatigue. So we're finding that balance between stimulus and recovery, which is crucial for steady, consistent muscle growth over time. Because if you just hammer yourself, you're going to create quite a stimulus, but you're not going to be recovering back to that baseline. Now that we have a framework, let's look at what actually drives hypertrophy. So we got three primary drivers for hypertrophy: mechanical tension, metabolic stress, and muscle damage. Now, each of these three play a role in signaling muscle growth, but mechanical tension is the big one, honestly the only one we really care about, which is pretty much the sole driver of hypertrophy. So now that we know that, we can kind of discard the other two. And mechanical tension is basically when your muscle fibers experience resistance under load, and they respond to that tension, activating mechanoreceptors within the fibers. This signaling process initiates hypertrophy, so we want to maximize mechanical tension in our workouts. Metabolic stress is that second driver, the one we're kind of discarding, and it happens when you feel that intense burn, like your high rep sets, you're doing like a 30 rep set, that extreme burn, that's the accumulation of metabolites like lactate that create that fatigue and then can trigger muscle fiber recruitment. This metabolic buildup, especially near the point of failure, does signal your body to recruit more fibers, which contributes somewhat to muscle growth, but nowhere near as much as mechanical tension. And then lastly, we have muscle damage, which is honestly what I chased for so long in the gym. I thought, muscle damage is where it's at. You damage your muscles and they rebuild. But that is caused by micro tears in the muscle fibers, particularly during the eccentric part of the movement. So when you're lowering the weight, and then the body's response to these tears includes inflammation and some satellite cell activation, both of which are crucial for muscle repair and growth. That's why you do not want to hop in an ice bath or cold plunge or take any anti-inflammatory supplements right after you train, because you're blunting your body's natural inflammatory response and quite literally stopping the muscle growth you just spent an hour or so in the gym trying to get. So don't do that. But one thing to remember, too much muscle damage can actually hinder recovery and then subsequently limit hypertrophy. So we're not actively chasing muscle damage. Like I said, in the past, I was quite an active chaser of muscle damage. That was very much me, but now we know mechanical tension is where it's at. So muscle damage is just more a byproduct of effective training. So we've got our three main drivers, but there's one overarching principle that kind of ties it all together, and that is progressive overload. Progressive overload means gradually increasing the demand on your muscles over time. If you don't have this, nothing else really matters. Progressive overload is king. So what exactly does progressive overload look like in practice? It means lifting a bit more weight, doing more reps with the same weight, or improving your technique or form. That is progressive overload as well. So these small, consistent increases force your body to adapt, leading to muscle growth. Without progressive overload, your muscles will simply adapt to the same load and stop growing. So people often ask, now that we're going from mechanical tension to progressive overload, let's say you're nailing those two, how do you know if your training is working? And you're not really seeing visual progress in the gym because let's say body fat's accumulating, or for whatever reason you're not tracking your rate of gain or taking good progress pics or whatever. So, but a good sign within your training is if you're progressing. If you're lifting heavier weights, doing more reps, or getting better control with the same weight, that's a good sign your training is working. If you're stalling, it may mean your training volume, intensity, or recovery needs to be adjusted and played around with a little bit. So, putting it all together, here's how to set up a hypertrophy focused program, very science based over here, that incorporates everything we just discussed. So, we want four things: volume, intensity, frequency, exercise selection, and then we'll tag on rest periods. We'll go over those four. Volume is the total number of sets and reps you're doing for each muscle group each week. So for hypertrophy, most people find, we've all heard the 10 to 20 quality sets per muscle group per week range, but there's research coming out saying we could go way higher than 20. There's some people that can get away with 4 to 6 sets per week, so it's very personal dependent. Now, beginners, I'd start on the lower to mid end and then build up as your body adapts. However, with beginners, you also have to keep in mind, if you're new to training, that those sets aren't going to be quality sets because you haven't learned how to train hard yet. Like, training is a skill in some sense, so you haven't learned how to execute properly, and the intensity side of the equation is probably not there yet. So you could probably get away with starting a little higher, but let's say for some reason you're training with a friend who knows what he's doing, and he's telling you, yeah, look, like your intensity's on point, your form's looking good. I'll start on the lower end, and then you can build up from there. Now, too little volume won't provide enough stimulus, while too much volume can lead to excess fatigue without allowing for full recovery, like we spoke about before, that recovery and then adaptation. Next, we want intensity, which is obviously how hard you're pushing yourself within each set. For muscle growth, you want to be taking your sets within 3 RIR, so 3 reps in reserve. If you ever heard RIR, all it means is reps in reserve. So from there to complete failure is where you want to sit. There's a lot of arguments out there with the science-based community, like, do you train to failure because the fatigue cost of training to failure versus 3 reps in reserve versus 1 or 2 reps in reserve, is it worth it? My stance on it is that the thing is, very very few people can actually accurately judge where 0 RIR is. So you might as well aim for 0 RIR, because the likelihood is your 0 RIR is probably like 3 reps in reserve. And I'm even saying that for myself sometimes. It takes an extreme amount of time in the gym to be able to, and training around people who are extremely intense. Like, if you watch the guys out of the UK, like Jordan Peters, if you guys know who that is, or my name AJ Morris, my first coach, actually bodybuilding coach. Those guys know how to train to failure. Or Kuba Sealand, those guys of the UK, they know how to train to failure. But most people in reality are hitting that 3, maybe even higher when they think they're hitting failure. So I would always aim for failure, unless you're an advanced lifter, because your ability to judge where 3 reps in reserve is on point. So for example, for my diet right now, I'm only training 1 to 2 reps in reserve just to manage that fatigue to stimulus ratio. So keep that in mind. Now, how often should you train each muscle group? The current research supports training each muscle group at least twice a week for optimal muscle growth. So splitting your volume across 2 or 3 sessions per week will yield the best results compared to, let's say, if you're doing a bro split and you're only training a muscle group 1 time per week. When it comes to exercise selection, you want a combination of multi-joint lifts and single joint lifts, so compounds and isolations. So starting a session off with some more demanding exercises that involve more than one muscle group, and then finishing your session off with isolation movements, for most people, will offer fantastic results. And then just to touch on rest periods, because they 100% do play a role in hypertrophy and muscle growth, or your more taxing exercises let's say hack squat, anything that's really taking the breath out of you, around 2 to 4 minutes of rest is sufficient. And for isolations, around 2 minutes as well is good. We just don't want to be taken away from our sets unless you have implemented like a mile rep set or some type of intensifier where you're adjusting that rest period. We just want to avoid going into our next set still fatigued from the set we just finished, so we're not potentially taken away from it. Now, when it comes to rep ranges, as it's a pretty common question I get asked, we talk about rep ranges. We know the data that anywhere from 5 to 30 reps produce comparable outcomes in terms of hypertrophy, as long as a certain amount of effort is reached, like we spoke about before, that within 3 RIR. Reason being that when it comes to hypertrophy, we're looking at motor unit recruitment per set. So within those final 5 reps to failure, that's when higher threshold motor units recruitment is going to occur. So that's going to be sufficient to initiate adaptations that lead themselves to hypertrophy. So if I go and do 5 reps on a chest press, that first rep is going to be quote unquote an effective rep. So from that first rep, motor unit recruitment is going to be sufficient to generate a hypertrophy adaptation all the way up to that 5th rep when we're tapping into these higher threshold motor units. So each of those reps is going to be a quote unquote effective rep. Now, if I do a 30 rep set on the same chest press, then it's not going to be an on and off switch like from 25 reps onward I start to generate sufficient adaptation for hypertrophy, and if I only did 24 reps, I'll get nothing. But there's going to be this kind of response, but really those last 5 reps are where a sufficient amount of motor unit recruitment are going to be occurring. So with that said, I don't really want to do 20 reps for a 25 rep set and then do a whole 20 reps until I get to those last 5 reps that are quote unquote effective. So my preferred rep range, all of them are going to work. Now there are discussions and evidence presented that higher rep range lead to potentially more fatigue, and fatigue is the absolute enemy of hypertrophy. I haven't dug into the literature enough, to be honest, and I see a ton of well-educated people on either side arguing separate points on this. So I don't think it's set in stone yet, but just to make you guys aware, higher rep ranges contribute to more fatigue, and we do not want fatigues. That will negatively impact the amount of tension that we can produce each set and the amount of motor units that we can recruit in the subsequent sets after that first high rep set. So really, with all of that in mind, again, like I said, 5 to 30 reps, it will work, but my recommendation is to perform the lowest rep range possible, but with the caveats of not impacting stability, not impacting joint or ligament or tendon function. So if you get pain at a lower rep range on an exercise, don't perform it there. Like if you want to do quite a higher risk exercise, you could up the reps a little bit just to be safer. If your stimulus to fatigue ratio, we could say, is higher with specific rep ranges in some exercises than others, then I would just pick the lowest rep range. So long story short, rep ranges, really the lowest rep range that we can feel stable, not have joint pain, have a good amount of output, and not feel a significant amount of fatigue from. That's the rep range. So I'd recommend you guys look at each exercise. If you can be stable at lower rep ranges, let's say 5 to 8, I'd go for it. If you can't, go slightly higher and just go for whatever the lowest number is. But also exercises like forearm curls, I like to go 10 to 12. It's honestly, with that in mind, the rest is completely up to preference. So anywhere from, I would say, 5 to 12 reps, it's pretty damn solid. As long as it's over that 4 to 5, you're all good, and that's really it. So now that we know at a higher level what we want to be after within our training, within the individual sets, there's one thing that will make or break your progress, and that's execution. Execution is everything if your goal is muscle growth. If you just want to be strong and move as much weight as you can from point A to point B, then you don't need to worry about execution. However, if you're more like me and you want to use weight as a tool to build muscle, then execution is so important. Every rep should have control and intention behind it. This is where your form and technique really matters. To maximize mechanical tension, we want to use a controlled tempo, especially on the eccentric phase. Slowing down that lowering part of the movement helps create more tension on the muscle, which is exactly what we're after. So a good rule to go by is a 2 to 3 second eccentric pause in the deep stretch, and then a powerful to make sure we're hitting effective reps. These are the reps at the end of the set, close to failure, where the muscle is really pushed, where we're recruiting the high threshold muscle fibers, which are the most hypertrophy responsive fibers. So when you're training for hypertrophy, you want to get close enough to failure to stimulate these fibers effectively. So if you're not getting close to failure, you're missing out on those effective reps and therefore will not be applying a great enough stimulus to elicit an adaptation. That's why intensity is huge, and when you find the perfect balance between extreme intensity, perfect or pretty as damn good as you can get it execution, which is your form, tempo, and technique, your muscle growth from your training will be exponential as long as you're applying progressive overload to that. So if you're applying all of what we just spoke about and you're not seeing the gains you're after, there are ways to tweak your training, and here are a few adjustments you can make. One is you can consider increasing your volume. This could mean adding another set or multiple sets to a specific muscle group that needs more focus across the week. Another approach is to increase your training frequency. If a muscle group isn't growing, training it more often throughout the week can help get the volume that you need without overloading a single session. For example, I'm currently doing this with forearm training because I want those Chris Williamson forearms. If you know what I'm talking about. That guy, some crazy forearms. I don't know. His parents blessed him, but I did not get blessed. So because I only train 4 times per week, I follow upper or lower split, and I want to improve my forearms. I place 2 to 3 sets of forearms at the beginning of every workout, and I can do that because they're not taken away from anything later in that session, provided I use straps for my pulling exercises, which is a absolute must if you're not. But before you add more sets or increase your frequency, always evaluate the quality of your work. So the quality of your sets. Every set should be, like we went through, high quality, proper form, controlled tempo, high intensity, and focusing on the target muscle. So it's often better to improve the quality of what you're doing than just piling on more and more sets, which can lead to you doing junk volume and then not recovering and entering a state of chronic overtraining. So we don't want that. Now, I wanted to wrap this up with 4 fairly common mistakes that can hold back your progress quite a bit. The first that we kind of just went over is thinking that more volume, so more sets, is always better. More sets does not equal more growth. While higher volume can lead to more growth, it does have a ceiling. So, too much volume without enough recovery just leads to fatigue and will stall your progress. We've touched on progressive overload a lot, but it's really the king of hypertrophy. The second mistake is not tracking your progress. If you're going to the gym and you're lifting the same weights for the same reps week after week, or you're not tracking your training, or you're not being mindful of what you did the week before, you're not providing your muscles with a reason to grow. So always keep track of your weights and reps. Very easy to do. Logbook, use an app, notes on your phone, and aim to improve in small increments over time. Either adding a rep, so let's say you did 5 last week, let's go for 6 this week. Adding 5 pounds in matching reps, adding less than 5 pounds, 1 pound, 2.5 pounds on isolations, or both. If you're new to lifting, you can make big progressions. You can add 5 pounds and another rep. So small progressions with standardized form over time is the best route you can take when it comes to progressive overload. Overall, arching theme there, track your training so you can actually apply that to each individual set because you're not going to remember what you got on X set halfway through a workout. Mistake number 3 is poor exercise execution. I see a lot of people sacrificing form to lift heavier weights, which actually takes tension off the muscle. Remember, hypertrophy is about muscle tension, not just moving weight from point A to B. So make sure you're performing each rep with control and focusing on the muscle you're trying to actually grow. Record your sets. Easy way to do that. Watch your form, and you can just look for ways to improve. Look at your form compared to someone who's a good trainer, good at training, and just watch the difference. See like, oh shit, this guy's doing this, I'm doing that, and then you can kind of compare. And the last mistake I see, honestly, too often for the amount of information which is readily available at our fingertips these days, is skipping rest days or not prioritizing recovery. If you train every day without rest, your muscles don't have the time they need to repair and grow. Growth happens during recovery, not while you're lifting, so make sure to schedule at least 1 rest day per week. 1 to 2 is best training, so 4 to 5 times per week is usually the sweet spot, and listen to your body. Quality sleep, proper nutrition, a solid lifestyle habits will make a massive difference in the amount of muscle you're able to build. Like, I remember when my recovery was all over the place. I wasn't prioritizing my sleep. Nutrition was super mid. Stress was a little higher. Was not building that much muscle. Translate that over to I'm nailing my sleep, optimizing my nutrition, managing stress, lifestyle. My habits are on point, building significantly amount more muscle tissue. So that is a wrap on today's podcast. Hopefully you now know how to maximize your training as it pertains to muscle growth and are confident that what you're doing in the gym is yielding the most amount of results possible, because to me that's fun, going in there and knowing what I'm doing in here is giving me the best results possible. So as long as your recovery is on point, and you can make sure that is the case by watching this podcast here on how to optimize your sleep, your number one recovery tool. And if you want free training plans that I've put together, both a 4 times per week plan and a 5 times per week plan, you can get it in my free 30-day email series, which is the first link in the description. Get huge. Peace.